Frank A. Mason is a retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel who also served as a college professor for 25 years. As an officer in the U.S. Air Force, Mason flew B-52s during the Cold War, served as a flying training instructor, and directed high-level staff organisations over 22 years of his early adult life. And he's on the line here. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm doing smashing, thank you. Now, you've got a book called Journeyman, The Bridge, a novel of the American Revolution. What's the inspiration behind the book?
I've been for probably all of my life since I was young enough to, old enough to remember, maybe 6 years old. I've been exposed to people in the military history. My father collected antique guns, that kind of thing. So I was constantly exposed to stories of the military, and I grew up in South Carolina, which is one of the 13 original colonies. And so there was a lot of colonial history. Spent the latter half of my childhood in Georgia, which was also a colony. So I was exposed to a lot of the history, and along the way, I decided there were stories to be told. And so one day, after I'd retired from all of the money-making endeavors, I decided I could write a novel.
Yeah. What would you say the main idea of it is?
Well, the basic plot line, and it's going to become a 6-book series. The basic plot line of the first novel, which is Journeyman, The Bridge, is the early life and then Revolutionary War, early experiences of the Revolutionary War for a young man who lives in North Carolina. He's become a journeyman gunsmith. Ultimately pursues becoming a master gunsmith, and his whole life he has planned on moving himself to the frontier, which in the days of the American Revolution would have been Tennessee, which is of course now not the frontier, and he just wants to pursue life there. Has a sweetheart he's interested in marrying, and the two of them going to the frontier and setting up a little gun shop, serving the needs of the pioneers, and that kind of thing. But at every turn, he finds himself pulled into the fight for American independence. Yeah. And so he has a constant stress of his desired future, and yet his country calls, I suppose you would say.
And did you have any personal experiences that helped you write this series?
Yeah, I would say when I was small, all the way up until my father passed on a few years back, he was a collector of antique firearms. He would tell me the stories of, how this gun was, used or where it was and how he found it, and that and the other. And so I sort of built up a mental picture of what it might have been to be a gunsmith in the 1700s. And so that aided me in being able to describe what this man's work was like when he was working as a gunsmith.
Yeah. And how long did the book take you to write?
There's sort of two answers to that. The actual writing was maybe 10 weeks of fairly intense effort, but then there was probably 20 years of finding a tidbit of information about the American Revolution and storing it away. Stack of books, a head-high stack of books on the American Revolution. And so I was surprised when I sat down to write the actual story that all of that research was sort of came to the fore without me actually saying, gosh, I need to go get this book or get that book. I certainly had to do that some, but it sort of flowed out as a result of years of sort of being immersed.
Wow. That's quite incredible. That doesn't happen to a lot of people, does it?
No. And I had, as everyone is, I've been somewhat intimidated by the idea of trying to put down ideas on paper that you would call a novel, and that it would be a story that you had developed and so forth. But I did have a lot of background writing. I'd spent a number of years as a staff officer in the U.S. Air Force and had to write papers for the boss and for the boss's boss, as high as frequently as the commander of the whole organization. At one point, I was at U.S. Pacific Command, and we often wrote for the commander of U.S. Pacific Command for him to respond to some request. Required a lot of research. And then, of course, when you become a college professor and you're sort of forced into getting a doctoral degree, you're forced into writing that really most intimidating of all pieces of paper, a dissertation. And I actually found that all of that research background, the research for writing for a senior military officer, all the policy requirements that you might have to dig up, and then all the research for writing a doctoral dissertation kind of set me up to be able to peel away the stuff that was really not terribly important and try to get to the core, which actually helped quite a bit.
Did you encounter some ironies when you were writing the series?
Oh, there were ironies all over the place. The second book, by the way, was just published last night. It's entitled Journeyman, Heart of Tempered Steel. And without giving away the plot, at one point there's a battle. As you would imagine, it's a war, right?
Yeah.
And our hero, along with three other not so highly ranked people, escort the general across a river. And I had written that because I was just sitting there and I said, what would they do? And I said, well, they would try to get the general across the river since the Americans were going to lose this fight. Well, then probably 2 days later, I encountered the letter written the night of that battle, the losing fight, written by that American general to his superior saying, well, it didn't go so well. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And in the middle of the letter, he said, I was able to get across the river with 2 officers and 2 enlisted men. And I was just utterly astounded because that's what I had written. And yet there it was in black and white that's what actually happened. And I honestly tell you that I had no earthly idea when I wrote that.
Wow. When you wrote this book, did you do anything to help you get in the mindset, or did it just come naturally?
I had lived in South Carolina and Georgia growing up, and then I have friends in North Carolina near where some of the action started in the book. And then I had briefly lived in the Philadelphia area. And so when it came to trying to put myself in the character's shoes, I had been in places where that character would now be as part of the story. In the first book, he chances to travel to Philadelphia. And so I had a mental picture of Philadelphia, and some research sort of rounded that out for what it might have looked like in 1777. And so it was easy to, well, I won't say easy. It was not terribly intimidating to try to get inside of his head and what he would have seen. I wrote this in first person. I should correct that. I wrote it third person, but with his viewpoint. So no one else's ideas are in there. It's only what Will Yelverton, my lead character, it's only what he saw and what he was doing. So if he saw someone else doing something, I tried to make it a historically accurate thing. What he might have done, I tried to make it historically accurate. The one thing you have to do is, if you're going to put words in the mouth of a historical person like George Washington, for example, you have to think about how he might actually have expressed himself and try to do that without seeming kind of hokey, without it seeming strained.
Yeah. Had you written any books before this?
I hadn't written any novels. I had written, like I mentioned, a dissertation, a doctoral dissertation. I also had, as part of my work as a management consultant right after I retired from the Air Force, I had written a number of 200 or 300 page books for clients, things like how-to manuals on how to manage a project, that kind of thing. So I drew on a background in leadership and management and a master's in industrial management that I'd gotten a number of years before, and wrote those kind of things. So I'd done a lot of technical writing, but I hadn't done any novel writing.
So what made you want to start novel writing?
I was retired, and you can only play so much golf, you know. And at one time in my life, I thought that there would never be enough golf. You know, I could play golf all the time and be happy. But after having sort of lived a life of writing an awful lot and reading the writing of students and that kind of thing, it was sort of natural to step into writing novels.
And in terms of this book, or this series, The Journeyman, why do you think it's a good time to read about the American Revolution?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because when I started this, I hadn't really paused to think about the timing. I just thought, you know, I wanted to write a book about the American Revolution. And one day I was sitting there and I said, well, where are we anyway? And I realized that we're coming up on a quarter of a millennium, 250 years since the beginning of the American Revolution, April of 1775, and then April of 2025 will be 250 years since Lexington and Concord. And I was really surprised. I said, gosh, and I hadn't really thought of that. You know, I was thinking about a million things, and I thought, well, maybe people would be interested in knowing what it might have been like to be sort of a common man that through no real planning or thought of his own, you know, he finds himself in the middle of a fight. In fact, early in the book, he more than once he says to his friends and cohorts, some of whom are firebrand revolutionaries and some of whom are just friends from years and years, he's frequently commented, "Aren't we all Englishmen? Why are we fighting?" Which was not an uncommon sentiment. Not every American was a revolutionary. Not every revolutionary was necessarily rabid for that outcome. And so, you know, it just sort of evolved into what it was, you know.
Do you think you would have written this book if you weren't American?
Probably not. That's an interesting question, and I probably would not have written it because I don't think I would have the framework to hang this story on. I really admire the work of people like Ken Follett, and I can enjoy reading his novels about, you know, England and early days history of England. But I don't think I could write that novel because I'm not an Englishman, so I haven't lived in you know, in the environment. I would have to go and immerse myself in that kind of thing. Yeah. So that I could then actually, you know, sort of get into a rhythm of what it might be like.
Yeah. Would you really be interested in the American Revolution if you weren't American?
That's a difficult question to be really definitive about.
Yeah.
I would say that the American Revolution started the end of the Enlightenment, you know, where the Renaissance, you might call the Renaissance the beginning of the Enlightenment, you know, and the views of the world about scientific method and humanism and questioning religion and that kind of thing. The American Revolution, I think, started the sort of the denouement of the Enlightenment in that. I've read that people believe the death of Voltaire, I think it was 1804, was really truly the definitive end of the Enlightenment. But I think the American Revolution, followed by the French Revolution, I think that pulled all the Enlightenment ideas to the forefront, tested them, found them to be good ideas. But then what do you do for an encore? And I think what we did for an encore among the Western nations is I think we all espoused as much as you could the ideas of the Enlightenment, but I don't think it was as explicitly in the forefront. I think the American Revolution put a hard stamp on the idea of freedom of the individual, respect for individuals. Of course, we've had a long way to come here, 250 years, and we're still struggling with the ideas of race and slavery and all of the ills that accompanied some of the actions that went on at that time. So to answer your question, yeah, I think I would see the American Revolution as important because I think it helped awaken the ideas of freedom among the masses.
And what do you think about America today in relation to the revolution?
Well, that's another good question. I think we try to live up to those ideals that were espoused by great writers like Thomas Jefferson and the actions of people like George Washington. You know, when the American Revolution ended, the fight was not really over. You know, there was a lot of civil war still going on in what had been the former colonies. There were atrocities still committed. The United States still had an economy grounded in slavery that we had to fight another civil war to resolve that we would not have slavery. And yet we still have issues of how are people to be treated and how do they live and you know, what are their rights and so forth within the framework. I think that the American Revolution kicked off a worldwide conversation about what is freedom. I think our Constitution was perhaps getting to be the end of the American Revolution, although I don't think it was truly the actual very end. And then I think, you know, we still had to fight another war against Great Britain in 1812 to fully establish our nationhood. So, you know, it's every nation goes through a cycle of war and peace and conflict and internal questioning. And so what are we doing right now? I think the United States is continuing to question, you know, who are we? You know, how will we live? How shall we relate to other people in the world?
And do you think you could write more books after you've done this series?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, probably next week, as just sort of a labor of fun, I've written a novel that's a modern suspense novel. My wife says kind of like James Patterson. I think more like John D. MacDonald, who is long dead and many people don't know him. But if you've ever seen the movie Cape Fear, you've seen, you know, a production of his writing. So I've written that, and I think that'll probably go to press this coming week. And then I have another historical series. I live in St. Augustine, Florida, which is the oldest city in the United States, which, of course, for you Europeans, you know, people say, oh, 1565, a new city then.
Yes.
But we look at it as the oldest city. And so I have a series that's slowly coming together that I'm tentatively calling La Florida. I intend probably to pick that story up, not at the very beginning with the whole Fountain of Youth myth and that kind of stuff, but rather in 1763 when the Spanish got on ships and left and the British showed up and said, boy, there's nobody here. You know, for 20 years, Florida was British, which, by the way, the British fixed a lot of infrastructure that the Spanish had not found necessary to do much with. So we got a pretty good system of roads. Then the Spanish took back over, and there's myriad stories, historical fact. There has been, I couldn't tell you, there have been probably as many as 10 shooting wars between Florida and Georgia. Wow. So I'm thinking about that. I've discovered through some ancestry research that I have very deep Florida roots, even though I was not born here. My mother is a Floridian. She's long passed away, but her people were here going back as far as non-Spanish Europeans. So when the Spanish left, I guess my mom's people came in.
Yeah. Well, where are we able to find the Journeyman series?
Well, it's on all of the major platforms, Amazon, You can get Kindle or the paperback. And immodestly, I say the paperbacks are pretty spectacular. My publisher, Amazon Pro Hub, has done really a great job of creating the cover book, the book covers, and so forth. And they're also on Barnes and Noble, Ingram Spark, and Google. And I think that they're easily available in all 4 places.
Excellent. Well, many thanks for joining us on the show. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you.